attention to, but we're going to try to cover probably 3 to 4 chapters per Wednesday until we finish the book of Genesis. So that's the plan for tonight. Starting in chapter 30, Jacob's descendants and his dealings with Laban. The first 24 verses of chapter 30 talk about Jacob's children through Bilhah, Zilpah, Leah, and Rachel. And I've got a chart out there. The chart's on the table, and it actually comes from Bob Winton's commentary on Genesis. But it shows you the women, their children, and the meaning of the children's names, which is a pretty interesting thing to study. All right, I'll do it. Genesis 31 and 2. When Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. Well, that's quite a demand. And then to add the or else I will die part. Anyway, Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? I can't do anything about this. So, what's the solution? Similar to Abraham and Hagar, isn't it? And I pointed that out. I've tried to keep pointing these things out, these things that keep happening in cycles in this family. So, behold my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. It's an interesting phrase. The only other time we see that is in Genesis 50 with Joseph. And the only thing that, like I said, I've told you before, I'm reading about 6 commentaries on Genesis as I'm preparing for this class. And the only thing that people come up with is like, it's the idea, and this is your first blank, it indicates the legal connection between the children and Rachel, even though Bilhah gave birth. Bilhah, of course, being her handmaid, but being a concubine, what's her position? It's kind of secondary. There's not really there's no same level of privilege or right, you might say, as there is for the wife. So that's the idea behind that phrase, seems to be, the legal connection. And I've got the reference there to Genesis 50, where it talks about Joseph. So again, these first 24 verses follow these events. Okay, so Bilhah has those children, Dan and Naphtali, as the text reveals. You skip down to verse 9, and it says, When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her Jacob to wife. Well, Zilpah then has Gad and Asher. All right, so 2 more. And then we get to a pretty interesting section of Scripture here. Verse 14. And Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest, and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them unto his mother Leah. Of course, Reuben's the oldest. Then Rachel said to Leah, Give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. And she said unto him, Is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband? Oh, so now we're getting personal. And this goes back, we talked about this pattern of polygamy, and it never turns out good. Things always go wrong. So, not only do you have my husband, now you want my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, Therefore he shall lie with thee tonight for my son's mandrakes. So we'll make a little deal here. Jacob came out of the field in the evening. He's got nothing. He doesn't know what's going on. And Leah went out to meet him, and said, Thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. And of course, you've got Issachar, Zebulun, and then Dinah is born according down through verse 21. So the mandrakes, what's the deal on that? Well, the deal on that is I don't exactly know. I did find in several of the commentaries, and I did some looking online apart from what I normally read, and I put it in your outline here. Traditionally, this was called the love apple, and it was thought to be an aphrodisiac or to help with fertility. That's your next blank, fertility. So it's kind of one of those traditional, what would you call it, home remedy kind of things. But Rachel and Leah make a bargain about Jacob while he's nowhere around, and now he has these children by Leah. It's interesting to watch the life of Jacob, because what does Jacob mean? What does that name mean? Supplanter, okay. Heel catcher, do what? Heel grabber, heel catcher, yeah. And here in chapter 32, his name's going to be changed to Israel, one who struggles with God. And I've talked about this a little bit, is, there's some things that go on in his life that are not exactly commendable, but as things happen and as he grows, you see his faith grow too. And I've got some stuff in the outline about that, but this is just one of those instances in Scripture that records the historical event, and there's not a lot. There's no explanation as to the significance of the mandrakes, but they make a deal with this. And again, three, 2 sons and a daughter are born to Jacob and Leah. Any questions or comments on that? Somebody had asked me specifically about those, and I didn't know how far we go, but there's just not a whole lot of information out there on it. But that's what I found on it. All right. Verses 25 to 43, Laban comes back into the picture. And who is he? Who's Laban in this whole story? Yeah. And the back and forth between these two, quite interesting that we see happen. We're not going to read all of this, verses 25 to 30, but I'm going to point some things out that I've got circled in my Bible. The arrangement, what I call it here, the arrangement between Jacob and Laban. And so Rachel, in this whole process, well, this is verses 22 through 24, Rachel then gives birth to Joseph, which Joseph covers the majority of the book of Genesis, starting in chapter 37. Then beginning in verse 25, you have this agreement with, this arrangement, let's say, between Jacob and Laban. It came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go into my own place and to my country." To me, this is kind of similar to the herdsmen of Lot and the herdsmen of Abraham back in Genesis 13. There's just too many of us. We need to split up. That kind of idea, maybe. I need to go to my own country. Well, okay, so he needs to go to his own country. Do y'all remember from last week where he is, where Jacob went to find his wife? Yeah, where they came from, basically. It's got 2 names, Padan Aram and Haran, but yeah, up in Ur of the Chaldees, like Jeff said, way up north. So he wants to go back home, where that's where the promise is, isn't it? That God had made to Abraham. So let me go. Give me my wives, my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go. How long did he serve for his 2 wives in total? 14 years. Okay. That's not a short period of time. Laban wants him to stay. And it's in his reasoning is interesting there in verse 27. I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. So it's kind of a selfish, I don't want you to go because I'm gaining out of this. So tell me what it would take, and I'll give it to you, verse 28. And he tells him what it would take. Somebody asked, why did he have to get permission from Laban? That's a good question. Let's keep looking here. Thou knowest how I have served thee, verse 29, and how thy cattle was with me. For it was little which thou hadst before I came, and it is now increased. And again, Laban recognized that back up in verse 27. And it is now increased unto a multitude, and the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming. And now when shall I provide for my own house also? Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? You want to go out and make your own way in the world and not necessarily be attached to somebody else? Well, what shall I give thee? Thou shalt not give me anything. If thou wilt do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. So he makes this deal. I'll go out among the cattle, the sheep, and I'll take out all the speckled animals, verse 32, the lambs, the goats. Those will be my wages, because that's the question that was asked here. So that's your next blank in the outline. Laban permits Jacob to set his own wages, according to verse 28, and Jacob prospers in that. Now there's going to be something a little bit later in the text that in chapter 31, as I have here, the way this all worked out is actually explained in chapter 31 in verses 4 to 13 when there's a confrontation after Jacob leaves anyway. So we'll touch on that when we get there. But Jacob sets his wages. Verse 33, so shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. And Laban said, behold, I would it might be according to thy word. So he goes out and does that, and he set out a 3 days journey. He put 3 days between himself and Laban, and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. But then verses 37 to 43, it's kind of like the mandrakes thing. There's not a lot of explanation. It's just, here's what happened. Jacob took him rods of green poplar and of the hazel and chestnut tree and pilled white streaks in them and made the white appear, which was in the rods. And he set the rods which he had pilled before the flocks and the gutters in the watering trough, and when they came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. So the idea maybe is something triggered their fertility. Again, there's not really a scientific explanation, but I think there is further explanation in chapter 31. And they brought forth cattle, ring-straked, speckled, and spotted. Verse 39 says, in the New King James it says, so the flocks conceived before the rods, and flocks brought forth streaked, speckled, and spotted. Streaked instead of straked. A little bit of a difference there. So Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the streaked and all the brown flock of Laban. And he put his own flocks by themselves and put them not unto Laban's cattle. It came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. So again, there's no scientific justification or explanation of this, but Jacob is a cattleman. He's a herder. He's got experience. He knows what he's doing. But I think there's more to it than just, let's say, the natural processes. And so he increased exceedingly, verse 43, had much cattle and maidservants, men servants, camels, and asses. Well, then he leaves. Verse 31. Chapter 31. The first 21 verses talks about that, his departure. And so your next blank is, because of Laban's abuse of Jacob, which really it would be a good thing from my perspective for Jacob to leave, but because of Laban's abuse of Jacob, God tells him to leave. If you look at verse 3, the Lord said unto Jacob, return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee. Why did he go up to Laban in the first place again? Up to Haran? He's running away from Esau. Well, eventually. But what was his primary concern of going up there? Got to get a wife. So, all right, that's all been accomplished. You're now abundant. Go back home. So, one thing, so that's verse 3, and then you see it again in verses, as I have in your outline here, verses 12 and 13. Lift up now thine eyes. This is God speaking to him in a dream. Verse 11. All the rams which leap upon the cattle are ring-streaked, speckled, gristled. I have seen what Laban has done unto thee. I am the God of Bethel. What is, from last week, what does Bethel mean? Y'all remember? El's the term for God, yeah. Beth is house, or house of God. I am the God of the house of God. Where thou anointest the pillar. Okay, go back to where you came from, in other words, is what he's saying here. Get out from this land and return unto the land of thy kindred. So this departure is, Jacob's been thinking about it. Well, now it's hastened by the command of God. So one thing I put in your outline here is throughout these events we are seeing the providence of God. What did the mandrakes have? I don't know. What about the poplars and the things that he was doing in the watering troughs? I don't know. But in this chapter, again, verses 4 to 13, God acknowledges, I have been with you, I have blessed you, now go back home. So there are some things in Scripture that are not explained for us and that we could speculate on, but God has been with him and blessed him. And that's what I put up here earlier. Notice the emphasis on God's blessing and revelation through that passage. So I went through the text here in Genesis 31. Verse 5, the God of my father has been with me. Verse 7, God did not allow him, Laban, to hurt me. Verse 9, so God has taken away the livestock of Laban and given them to me. And then beginning in verse 10 of chapter 31, he has a dream and a communication from God. So that's the providence of God working. Sometimes there were miracles involved, there's no question about that. But then sometimes it's just this idea of, as we say sometimes, God working in the background, like we see so many other times in Scripture. And like I've also said throughout this study of Genesis, there are gaps of time. Laban's been there 14 years just for his 2 wives, and then 6 years on top, so 20 years, and that comes out in the text too. Well, we're not told everything that happened in all 20 years. But what we are told is the presence of God throughout. And what do we always connect God's blessings on Jacob to? Abraham. And the same thing's true with Isaac. It's always back to the covenant that God made with Abraham. And it's continued. All right? Any questions or comments on any of that? Go back home. Chapter 31, verse 5? Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Like Jacob doesn't really want to call it his God until later on. I was trying to look for it, I couldn't see it just now. I think somewhere in like chapter 33 or 34, he refers to it as his God. Instead of just the God of my father, yeah. That is interesting. That's how he refers to him often. I don't know if you find that verse you're looking for. Let me know. I mean, he does. He repeated, like when he encounters Esau in chapter 33, like down in verse 10, or verse 11 rather. Please take my blessing that is brought to you because God has dealt graciously with me. So he acknowledges that continued blessing throughout his life up to that point. Well, that could be what I mentioned a bit earlier, is throughout this whole narrative, you see I guess you'd see his faith growing, because he does change. It seems that he changes slowly. Yeah. Yeah, no doubt about that. All right. Well, one thing that happens when they leave is, it starts in chapter 31, verses 14 to 21. Rachel and Leah want something. Jacob's blessed with all of this. What do we get? And so in verses 14 to 21. Is there any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? So what does Rachel do? What does she steal from her father nobody knows about? Little idols, household gods, the text tells us. That's down in verse, what verse is that? 19. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. Take some things into her own hands. Well, that's going to come up later. When Laban finds out that Jacob leaves, he pursues him, and then that subject comes up. So there's still some, well, that's stealing. We'll just call it what it is. And then there's some lying done about it. But anyway, we'll get there. Any questions or comments on anything so far? Like I said, this is the historical narrative. There's not a great deal to comment on. We're just moving through the text here. So he leaves, and starting in verse 22, Laban trails him. Let's see, verse 22. Laban was told on the third day that he has departed. And he pursued after him 7 days' journey, and they overtook him in the Mount of Gilead. Do y'all remember how far, I think it was last week, how far Jacob traveled to get to Padan Aram from Canaan? About 500 miles approximately. So this is no small journey. And again, how long would that take? All of these, you've got 4 women, all these children, there's no telling how long this journey would take. And when we sit down to read it, it's like we're just moving on through, and we're talking months here of events transpiring. So he overtakes him, and God came to Laban. This is an interesting verse, verse 24. God came to Laban, the Syrian, in a dream by night and said, "Take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad." Don't make any decisions yet. And so God has, and I've referenced this a few times as we've looked through Genesis, Hebrews 1:1. God, who at various times and in various ways has communicated or spoken unto the fathers by the prophets. This is one of those times. Now, Laban's not one of the fathers and he's not one of the prophets, but God is communicating to a bunch of different people, and, well, he tells him essentially what not to do. Be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad. So he overtakes him, and it's the back and forth here is interesting. Somebody read verse 26. Just read verse 26 for now.
And Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done that you have stolen away unknown to me and carried away my daughters like captives taken with the sword?"
My daughters. Well, who were they to Jacob? Laban, going back, I don't leave. I'm blessed because you're here. Well, these are my daughters. I just find that the way that verse reads kind of interesting. Well, so that goes on down through verse, let's see here, down through about verse 30. In fact, notice he acknowledges the communication from God. Verse 29. It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt. But the God of your father spake unto me yesternight. One of those old King James words, yesternight, last night. Saying, take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Verse 31. I was afraid. Well, don't you think with his past experience with Laban, he's justified in his fear? Laban is not a commendable character throughout all of this. So I think that's justified. Well, the subject comes up in verse 33. Well, the events come up. Somebody's stolen my gods. So Laban goes through everything, trying to find his gods. Verses 33 to 35 tell us that Rachel's taken them and hidden them under a camel's saddle, and she has an excuse that she can't get up, and allow him to search through everything. So he's just, what's the word when is pilfering, is that the right word? He's just going through everything. And Jacob has enough. Verse 36. Jacob was wroth, the King James says, and chode with Laban. He was angry and rebuked him. I don't know the last time. Have you ever chode with anybody? What's the deal here, basically? What have I done? You remember, Jacob doesn't know about what Rachel's done, stealing. What is my sin that thou hast so hotly pursued after me? You've gone through all my stuff. What have you found? Well, he hasn't found anything. Set it here before my brethren and thy brethren that, let's settle this right now. I'm speaking from a preacher's perspective here. And preachers, as you guys know, move sometimes. And sometimes the best thing you can do is move away from your family. A comfortable distance. Where if you want to go see them for a day or so, that works out okay. But then you can go back home and have, as I've heard it called, a buffer zone too. That's not a bad thing. Well, you've gone through everything. You've overstepped your bounds. 20 years, verse 38, I've served you. You've benefited from me, and if anything was lost in your herd, that fell on me, he says in verse 39. 14 years for your 2 daughters, verse 41, 6 years for your flock. Unless the God of my father, and there it is again, Joe, unless the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac. That phrase is only used twice in the Bible. It's just another, and that's another blank down here. Verses 42 and 53 refer to God as the fear of Isaac. And that's just another way to refer to Jehovah. Jehovah. But throughout all of this, I think I skipped a blank, God's active involvement is seen again, constantly. But Jacob's had enough of Laban here. They make an agreement that's basically the way I put it in your outline here. There's a non-aggression agreement between both sides, and they separate, and that's not always a bad thing. So we get into chapter 32. Esau meets Jacob and wrestles with God. Again, we're not going to read everything in here. So Jacob and Esau have been separated for 20 years, and things were not good when they parted ways. Because Jacob and, how did it work? Isaac was going to bless Esau. Rebekah overheard it and told Jacob how to deceive his blind father. And they parted ways for 20 years. These brothers haven't seen each other. I put in here verses 10 and 11. Jacob's faith is evident. Again, he's grown during this time. I am not, and this is him talking to God, I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. For with my staff I have passed over the Jordan, and now I am become 2 bands. I've grown a lot. I've been blessed a great deal. Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau. So he's in fear for his life there. And he sends, this is verses 13 to 21, an appeasement to Esau, a great present or a great amount of gifts. And then you have the reconciliation is recorded in chapter 33. But between all of that, between his fear and his preparation of this gift for his brother, Jacob wrestles with an angel, wrestles with God. And that's in verses 22 to 32. Now some, and I put this in your outline, some try to allegorize this event into prayer. They say he was struggling in his communication with God. I don't believe that for a second. The reason I don't believe that, somebody turn over to Hosea 12 and read verses 4 and 5, please. Hosea 12, verses 4 and 5. Okay. And in that, if you go back up and read the first part of that chapter, it's talking about the ancestors of both Judah and Israel, the northern and the southern tribes. And, well, he took his brother by the heel, verse 3. We know who that's talking about, Jacob. and in his strength he struggled with God, verse 3. I don't think there's anything about prayer in here. He struggled with the angel and prevailed. And that's recorded here for us. It's an interesting text, and again, there's not a lot of explanation. It just lays it out for us. He wrestled with a man. He wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched, the angel couldn't prevail against Jacob, and that's quite something. This, a shepherd is and you see this with David, particularly a lot in the Psalms. This is a formidable opponent. If you're going to wrestle somebody who deals with cattle, you guys remember, was it back in the 80s when, was it Nolan Ryan hit Robin Ventura? He hit with a pitch, and Ventura charged the mound. What did Nolan Ryan do? Y'all remember? Well, Nolan Ryan's a cattleman, isn't he? He just worked him over, man. It was funny. He just locked his head in and started wailing on him. Well, so the point being, this is an impressive event here if you really think about something like that. And but here's something else too. And this is the last line on the bottom of the page. Seems Jacob was permitted to prevail, because what did the angel do that finally broke the stalemate, let's say? Dislocated his hip. That'll do it. I don't care how strong you are. If you dislocate a joint, you're going to, so it seems Jacob was permitted to prevail, but it was because of his striving. He didn't just give up. And he was seeking a blessing. What was the blessing that was given to him? It's right there somewhere. What happened? He got a new name. You'll no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you're as a prince, verse 28, and with men. As a prince, you've had power with God and with men, and you have prevailed. Well, I want to know your name. Well, he never tells him his name. But I found this quote, and I thought it was interesting. Edwin Jones's commentary on Genesis. Jacob may have thought that his struggles were with Esau and Laban, but if he did, he was wrong. Jacob had been striving with God throughout his whole life, not just in this instance, but he emerged victorious through his maturing faith that had made him a changed man. And that's, again, we see that the maturation of his faith throughout this whole event, throughout all of these events, and he prevails with God. And again, that's the meaning of the name, one who struggles with God. Well, then you have this interesting statement added in verse 32, which tells us, we're taking Moses as the author of Genesis here. Therefore the children of Israel eat not of the sinew which shrank, which is upon the hollow of the thigh unto this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh and the sinew that shrank. There's nothing else in Scripture said about that. There are some rabbinical writings on this tradition, but there's nothing in Scripture that talks to us about it. But to me, and I put this in your outline, verse 32 shows the author, probably Moses, was familiar with the practices of Judaism. At this point in time, they're not known as the tribes of Israel yet. That doesn't happen until when? You got to grow. You got to become a nation. That happens in Egypt and all. So anyway, so the point being, the author is looking back into history. The children of Israel still don't do this because of what happened with Jacob in his wrestling with the angel. So his name is changed to Israel, he who struggles with God. And again, like I said, chapter 33, I just mentioned it in passing, is the reconciliation between Jacob and Esau. So just to cover it, Jacob has this envoy with gifts, just like what would you call it? There's a word I'm trying to think of. Well, okay. What is it when two people are at war and one side strikes first? Preemptive strike. I couldn't think of preemptive. preemptive strike against Esau. What does Esau do when they meet face to face? Hugs him and kisses him. 20 years these brothers have been separated, and I don't think that's the response that Jacob expected based on what he was trying to appease Esau before he even met him.
Verse 30 there, chapter 32, I think was the verse talking about where it says,
Oh.
"For I have seen God." I don't think he ever refers to God again as the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac.
Okay.
After he wrestles here with God, he says, "For I have seen God face to face."
That's interesting.
It's just God.
It's just God, yeah. Okay.
Might be something to that, maybe not.
Well, I kind of passed over that. Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen the face of God. And you see that EL ending again, L. So, but yeah, that is an interesting trend, Joe, that you've pointed out there. So,
Chapter 33 starts calling him my Lord.
okay. Chapter 33, my Lord.
Is he talking about God there? Is he talking about his brother?
Well, you got a verse? Verse 13, Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows." Oh, that's a reference to Jacob talking to Esau. And basically, he's subduing himself. He's kind of, yeah.
Calls him Lord, he calls himself servant.
Right. Did Jacob believe the angel to be God? He says he saw God face to face and lived. The text doesn't really say what he explicitly says this is God. Now he does say, "I have seen God face to face," but we see other things. Like it says that of Moses in Deuteronomy 34, "No man knew God face to face like he did." Well, that doesn't mean literally he saw God's face. God's a spirit. God doesn't have a face. But this is some manifestation, an angel that he wrestled with, and it's God's angel. But it might make you think of something if you were to wrestle an angel, that you were dealing with God himself. All right. Any questions or comments on any of that? Jacob goes back to Succoth, verse 17, build himself a house, built stuff for his livestock, and that's where he is. And then he came to Shechem. So he's back where he's supposed to be. All right. We'll pick up in chapter 34 next week.